Hey, good to see you. Okay. All right, good morning. Today's sponsorships are Naftali Tilson of Talmud Israel in honor of the yahrzeit of his dear parents, Rabbi Yomi ben Avram, Leib Ishtam Yashayev Torah, Rivka Bas Yaakov. To this week's learning is sponsored by Yehuda and Jenny Goodhart, Lila Nishmas, Yeshaya Zalman ben Lazar, and Binyamin and Alana Levin in honor of the birth of a granddaughter, Leora Sarah Levin. We are today beginning on Lamed. Today's daf is Gittin, daf Mem 40. We are starting on Lamed Tes Amud Beis, the last line. The overall topic of today's daf is freeing slaves. And then it kind of subdivides into four categories. The first category is whether an eved, whether a slave, can do a certain behavior, and if they perform a certain behavior, does that indicate to us that they have therefore been previously freed based on the behavior that they're doing, indicates that they wouldn't be doing it unless they've been freed previously. So that's the first topic, and we begin at the bottom. Amar Reb Chanina, Amar Reb Zera, Amar Reb Chanina, Amar Rav Ashi, Amar Rav, Amar Rabbi. Eved shenasa es rabu baschorin b'fnei rabu yatsa l'cheirus. If a slave marries a regular free woman, that is an indication that their master has freed them previously. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan said, Kol kach yesh biyadcha, is this the halacha that you have? Va'ani shona, the halacha that I have taught is, hakosev shtar erusin l'shivchaso, if a master tries to write a shtar of marriage for his slave woman, meaning he's essentially marrying his slave woman, Rabbi Meir says, mikudeshes, they are married. V'chachamim omrim, eino mikudeshes, and the chachamim say they are not married. So why is this true, that if the slave marries another woman and the master sees this going on and doesn't protest, that's indicative of the fact that the slave has been previously freed, or else the master wouldn't allow him to marry a free woman. Yet, when the master himself attempts to marry the slave woman, the Chachamim, who we follow, the Chachamim say, she's not married. That's not indicative of the fact that she has been previously freed. So the Gemara answers, Kida Amar Rabbi bar Rav Shila, Kisharabo hinyachlo tefillin. Rabbi bar Rav Shila later on in the daf is going to say this concept of a master putting tefillin on the eved. Hachanami, we can apply a similar concept here, and we will say, Kisharabo hisiu isha, that the scenario where it's indicative that the master has freed the slave is when it's not just that the slave marries a woman and the master doesn't protest, but it's rather that the master actually arranges the wedding for the slave. Since the master himself arranged the wedding for the slave and gave him the wife, that's indicative of the fact that he's been previously freed. So the Gemara asks, okay, but umi ika midi dila avde lo me'evad le isura v'ihu avad isura. We're saying then the fact that he arranged the wedding for the slave indicates that the slave has been previously freed. But in the scenario when he marries the slave woman, in that case, we say that doesn't indicate that the slave woman has been previously freed. But in that case, the master himself is engaged in the Aveira. He himself is marrying the woman. So in that case, if anything, we should for sure say in that case, it's indicative that she's been freed previously. So Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak said, the scenario of the master marrying the woman is not what we originally thought. It's not just a typical case where he writes her a shtar and then attempts to marry her. It's specifically the Amar law, where in the shtar it is written, Tzi'i bo v'hiskad shibo. In the shtar that he gives her, in the attempt to marry her, he makes it clear that he wants to free her with that shtar itself. Rabbi Meir Savar, Rabbi Meir holds, Yesh b'lashon hazeh lashon shichur. By doing that, that indicates that he has freed her. The Rabbanan Savri and the Rabbanan say, Ein balashon hazeh lashon shichur. In this specific case where he writes into the shtar, you should go free with this, and I'm attempting to marry you. So in that case, the Chachamim say, that language itself does not indicate that she has been previously freed. But in a typical case where he himself arranges a marriage and there's no shtar involved, he's just arranging a marriage for the slave, it's clear then that he would not be arranging a marriage unless he had previously freed the slave. On that note as well, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Eved shehiniach tefillin bifnei Rabo. An Eved who puts on tefillin in front of his master, Yatza l'cheiros. Again, this does not mean that he goes free. It means this indicates that he has been previously freed, because the master would not allow such a thing to take place unless he has freed him. Meisvei, we ask a question on this. Lo v'haimenu Rabo, if his master borrowed money from him, Osha Aso Rabo Apitropis, or the master appointed him as to oversee something, to be like in charge of his estate, Oshihiniach tefillin bifnei Rabo, or if he puts tefillin on in front of his master, Oshakar shlosha psukim beveis hakneses bifnei Rabo, or if he reads 3 psukim from the Torah, essentially means he gets an aliyah in shul in front of his master. In all these scenarios, hareze lo yatsa l'cheiros. This does not indicate that he has gone free. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi a moment ago said, if he puts tefillin on in front of his master, it indicates that he's gone free. And here it says clearly that that's not the case. So Amar Rabbi bar of Shila, here's what Rabbi bar of Shila says, Kisharabo hiniach lo tefillin. It's not just that he puts on tefillin in the presence of his master and he sees it, it's that the master himself actually assists in the putting on the tefillin. Again, we say that would not have taken place unless he had previously freed him. Okay, that's the end of the first topic. The next topic is going to take us to the end of this Amud, requires a bit of a short introduction, and that is an idea which has been mentioned, but the concept is that when a person owns a slave, there are 2 elements going on there, and that is they have something that's called a kinyan mammon. Kinyan mammon means I own a piece of property, I own something. That's one thing. The other thing that you have there is something called a kinyan isser. It means that you have a relationship with something, and due to that relationship, there are certain halachos that are involved. So, for example, when you get married, the Mishnah says, Hakona es ishto. So you don't actually, own your wife like a piece of property. Hakona es ishto means that, the Mefarshim say, it means that there's a kinyan isser. It means that now, due to the fact that we are married, so there are certain halachos that apply to myself and to her due to our relationship. So with an Eved as well, you have that. There's a kinyan mammon and a kinyan isser. So usually we don't really think of the difference of these things. The point is you either have an Eved or you don't have an Eved. The continuation of the Gemara here is going to start to split hairs and say that sometimes it's important to understand when the kinyan mammon exists and when the kinyan isser exists. Sometimes they kind of split up, and therefore that has certain ramifications. So the Gemara begins and it says, Amar ki aser Rav Dimi. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he reported the following thing in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. The halacha says, Misha Amar b'shas misaso, a person is about to die, and they make the following declaration. Plonis shivchasi al yishtabdu ba'ala achar mosi. He tells his children, don't work the slave woman after I pass away. So Rabbi Yochanan said, Kofin es hayorshin v'kosvin la get shikhr. We force the children, the inheritors, and they must free the woman, because the father said, don't work her after I die. Amru lefanav Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi said to Rav Dimi, Rabbi, iyatamoda shebaneha avadim? Aren't this woman's children, aren't they slaves? What does this mean? So Rashi says that, he says, I'll read it out loud. Rashi says, when the master says, don't work this woman, that's not a language that indicates that he's freeing her. Velo lashon hefker. He's not making her ownerless. Ella lo yatrichu ababodasa. He's saying, look, go easy on her. Don't bother. She's a nice woman. Like, don't drive her nuts. But any children that she has, she still retains the status of being a slave. The guy just said, don't work this woman. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi said, if the guy says that, why should the inheritors be forced to free her? They have perfect rights to the children that she would produce, they are slaves, and the inheritors have full rights to that. So ki asr of Shmuel bar Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, when Shmuel bar Yehuda came, he said that that was not a correct report. Rabbi Yochanan did not say anything about a guy who announced that he doesn't want his children to put his slave woman to work. That's not what he said. What he did say was the following. Misha Amar b'sha'as misaso. If a guy says before he dies, Plonis shifchasi, koras ruach asasali. She treated me nicely. Ye asela koras ruach. Therefore, after I die, don't bother her. Then kofin es hayorshin va'osela koras ruach. Then we would force the inheritors to do a kind act to her. What is the kind act? The kind act is freeing her. But it doesn't mean that the master himself freed the woman by this statement. He just said, treat her nicely, do something good for her. And that's understood. Do something good means to free her. My taima, why is this the halacha? Because mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames, there is a mitzvah to fulfill the words of a dying person. And therefore, since he made this request, we should follow through with that. So now more on this concept of someone making a declaration, which is going to have an effect on whether the slave is freed or not. Amar Amimar. Amimar says, Hamafgir avdo, if a person declares his slave ownerless, oso ha'eved ein lo takana, that slave has no remedy. That slave is stuck. They are stuck. Why are they stuck? So the Gemara says, my taima, gufe lo kanile. When you declare a slave ownerless, so now going back to our terms before, their body does not belong to you anymore, meaning you no longer own them as a kinyan mamon. However, isurahu deika gabe, there still exists this thing called the kinyan isser, which means there's still an element of me owning them. I just don't own them in terms of the concept of mamon, but I have some kind of connection to the slave, which can only be undone if I give them a document of emancipation, if I give them a shtar shichrur. But if you don't give them a shtar shichrur, that can't be done. So in this case, the person says, you're ownerless, okay? So they don't physically own the person anymore. But there's still the kinyan isser there. V'isura lo matzi maknile. And Amemar says the idea here that this kinyan isser cannot be given to the slave unless it comes together with the shtar shichrur, with the document that says you're free. Essentially, Amemar says, when you give a slave a document that frees them, it's a full package deal. They're free. That's it. But if you do some kind of act like here, where you declare them ownerless, in which case now the kinyan mamon is gone, but the kinyan isser still exists. So the problem is this slave now exists in a state of being limited in certain things they can and cannot do. One of the things they can't do is they're limited in who they can and cannot marry. So Amemar says that this slave is stuck. Okay, not everyone is going to agree to that. Amar le Ravashi la Amemar. Ravashi said to Amemar, V'ha Amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan, V'Rav Chia bar Elvan Amar Rav. How can you say that if a person declares their slave ownerless, that the slave is stuck? These two Amoraim said, Echad zeh ve'echad zeh, Yatza lecherus v'tzarich get shichrur. They both said that if a person declares their slave ownerless, they go free, and because they're declared ownerless, and you must write for them a get shichrur, a document that says they're free. Amar lay. So Amemar responded back, Tsarich ve'ein lo takana. He says, if you read carefully, what it says when you declare them ownerless, they become ownerless, and they require a get shichrur. He says, yes, they require that. That's what would be needed in order to completely square them away and set them on the path for total freedom. But the problem is, they can't get a get shichrur. Why can they not get the get shichrur? Because they're no longer owned by the master. So that kinyan isser, those limitations that they have, still are stuck with them, and they're stuck. Ikada Amri, others said, Amar Amemar, that Amemar's statement was made in slightly a different way. He said, Hamafkir avdo vames, if a person declares ownerless their slave, vames, and then the master dies. Oso ha'eved ein lo takana. That slave does not have any solution. They're stuck. My time. Why? Gufe lo kanilai. When they declare them ownerless, they no longer own the slave. Isurahu de'ika gabe. Again, but the kinyan iser still exists. V'isura livere lo moris. And that kinyan iser cannot be bequeathed to the children. When a person dies, their assets go to their children. In this case, the slave is only considered an asset as long as you have the kinyan mammon, as long as you own them. But once the master declared the slave ownerless, so he doesn't own the slave, he just retains this kinyan isser. And this kinyan isser is like neither here nor there. It limits a slave and who the slave can marry, but it's not something that can be inherited by others. Amar li Rav Ashi la Amemar. Rav Ashi said to Amemar, V'haki aser Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. But Rav Dimi said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan earlier, we quoted, Rav Dimi said that when just go back up for a moment. Rav Dimi said earlier on the daf, Rav Dimi said that if a person declares at the time that they're dying, a person declares to their children, don't work my slave, which is like a lashon of like freeing her, so to speak, we tell the children that they must write the shtar shichrur for the slave. So he says, why in this case, when the master declares the slave ownerless, and then the master dies, so you say the slave is stuck, why can't we tell the children to write the shtar shichrur, just like Rav Dimi said? So Amemar responds to Rav Dimi Tosei. We already said earlier above that Rav Dimi was mistaken, that's not correct. Amar le, so Rav Ashi said back to Amemar, my ta'usa, what was the mistake? We clarified this earlier. Delo amra b'lashon shichrur. Rav Dimi's scenario was that the master said, don't work my slave woman. But we pointed out that that's just because don't work her means, leave her be, don't drive her nuts. But had he actually said, I want you to free my slave woman, or he says, I'm making her ownerless, perhaps that would work. Ha'amra b'lashon shichrur, if he did say it in a way that indicated he wanted to free her, hachanami, that should work. Amar le, Sa'amema responded, Ana kiderav Shmuel bar Yehuda severely. I do not hold like Rav Dimi. We had two reports earlier. Both were made in the name of Rav Yochanan. Rav Dimi made one report, and then the Gemara said there was another report at which Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said that doesn't work. If a person says to their children, don't work my slave woman, it's of no consequence. That rather the statement was the person who said to the children, you should treat my slave woman nicely, and by doing that, you should free her. That was the statement. So Amemar said, that's the statement that I think was more accurate, and that's the statement I am following. Hahu diskarta, there was a city, da'avdi, of slaves, de'izdavin la'ovid kochavim, that was sold to a non-Jew. So essentially there was a certain area of slaves that was owned by a Jew, and this whole area was sold to non-Jews. Kalu marvasa basroi. The non-Jews, the second owners of this group of slaves, died. Asu likame de Ravina. The slaves came to Ravina, and they said, can you do something to allow us to be freed so that we can marry regular Jewish women? Amar lahu, Ravina said, Zilu ahadru abnei marvasa. Go back to the children of your original owners. You were originally owned by a group of Jews. You were sold to non-Jews. Go back to the children of the original Jews that owned you. V'yichtavu lecha gita decherasa. And they will write you a document that will free you. Amru le Rabbanan le Ravina. The Rabbanan said to Ravina, V'ha'amar Amemar. We've said earlier, Amemar says, Hamafkir avdo vames. If somebody declares their slave ownerless, and then the master dies, oso ha'eved ein lo takana, that the slave is stuck. So what do we see? We see the concept that the children are not able to write the shtar shichrur for the eved owned by the parents. Amar Lahu, Ravina said, Ana kirev dimi severely. I hold like Rev Dimi. Rev Dimi said earlier that when the master makes a statement, it says, don't work the woman. That means the Kinyan Mammon is gone. And the Kinyan Isser goes down to the children, and the children can free them. I hold like Rev Dimi, and therefore in this case, that would work. The children of the original Jews who owned these people, they could therefore go ahead and free this group of slaves. Amrule, they said to Ravina, de Rev Dimi ta'usahi. Rev Dimi was mistaken. The Gemara earlier said that Rev Dimi was incorrect. Amar Lahu, to which Ravina said, my ta'usa, what was the mistake? It was de lo amra b'lashon shichrur, that the way that Rev Dimi said the halacha was that the master said, al yishtabdu ba, don't work her. But if he actually made a declaration and a request to have her freed, ha'amra b'lashon shichrur, hachanami, it would work. V'hilchasa, and the Gemara concludes, the halacha ultimately follows kiravina, that if the master frees the slave, the Kinyan Mammon part of the slave, this Kinyan Isser that remains does continue on to the children, and the children have the ability to free the slave after the master dies. Now a quick story. Hahu Avda, Debetre. There was a slave that was owned by two people, a partnership. Kam Chad Minayu v'Shachare Lepalge. One of the partners freed his portion of the slave. Amar Idach, the other owner, so there's Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain and Shimon own a slave. Ruvain freed his part of the slave. So Amar Idach, Shimon says, Hashta Shami Be'Rabbanan Umafsadiluhu Minai. If the rabbis get wind of this, they're going to come to me and they're going to force me to free this person. Why? Because as long as I am retaining my chelek in the slave is limited in who can and cannot marry. So the rabbis are going to force me, they're going to twist my arm to let the slave go. So what did he do? He still wanted that part of the slave. Azal akne livno katan. He came and he transferred the ownership that he had in the slave to his child, who was a minor. The thought process being, right, that he kind of circumvented any kind of transactional thing that can happen after that, because now the slave is by the minor. The minor can receive things. If an adult gives a minor something in halacha, the minor does own it. However, the minor can't now transact that out to someone else. So now the slave is stuck with the minor, and the person can have the rights to their slave. Shalcha Rav Yosef reads Rabbi Lekame to Rav Papa. So Rav Yosef sent this question to Rav Papa, and Shalach Le, Rav Papa said, not so fast. Kasher asa kain ye'asa lo gemulo yashiv lo barosho. Exactly what this guy did, we are going to do to him. He thinks he's tried to outsmart the rabbis, we are going to outsmart him, we'll get him back. Anan kimlan bianuka de mekarba daita legabe zuzi. Everyone knows that kids like money. I thought he was going to say everyone knows that kids like lollipops, but he said everyone knows that kids like money. Okay, in those days it was different. So what did they do? Mokminan le apitrapis. We will appoint a person to oversee the child, to basically be in charge of the child's affairs. Umekar kishle zuze. And we will dangle some money there, meaning offering the slave some money. Offering the child money. And we will have this apitropis, this person who oversees the child's business affairs. They will be able to write the shtar shikhr and free the slave. Okay, next part of the Gemara till the Mishnah gets into the question of certain statements and phrases that a person can make. Does that indicate, again, that they have freed their slave with the following statements? Tana Rabbanan, the Brisa says, Ha'omer al sisi ploni abdi ben chorin. If a person says, I made my eved a free person, asui ben chorin, they have been made a free person. Harehu ben chorin, behold, they are a free person. Any one of those three statements, harehu ben chorin, that is a lashon of, that indicates that they have been freed. Esenu ben chorin, I will make the person a free person. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says, kana, the slave has acquired their own freedom. V'chachamim omrim lo kana. And the chachamim say it does not work. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, v'kulan bishtar. Just to clarify things, Rabbi Yochanan says, a person never goes free by the master saying something. All of these lashonos, all of these statements must be written in the actual shtar. In the document that frees them, it has to say one of these three things. If any one of these three things are said in the document, the person is free. Why do the chachamim say that if a person writes in the document, I will free my slave, and then they give the slave the document, why doesn't that work? So Rashi says, the hachi mashma esenu ben chorin. Sorry, let's start with Rabbi. Rabbi says it does work. Why does that work? Because esenu ben chorin b'shichr zeh shani moser lo achshav. I will make you free with this document that I am now handing to you. Here's the document, you're free, have a good day. That's what Rabbi says. The Chachamim say, lo kana, it doesn't work. Why? Because the Chachamim say, she'ein zu elo havtacha sheya'asenu ben chorin. When a person says, I will free you, that's just someone's word. That's someone guaranteeing, saying, in the future, one day I will free you. And therefore, if they write that in the document, that's not an indication, the Rabbanan feel that's not an indication that the document itself works to free the slave. Tana Rabbanan, similar concept with property. Ha'omer nasati sa deplonis leploni. If a person says, I gave this field to another person, nisuna leploni, this field has been given to this other person. Harehi shalo, this field belongs to another person. Harehi shalo, indeed the field belongs to person B. Etenena leploni, if I say, I will give this field to so-and-so, Rabbi Meir Omer Kana. Rabbi Meir says it works. V'chachamim omrim lo kana. And the chachamim say the person has not acquired the field with that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan says again, v'kulan b'shtar. All of these languages, we're not moving the field from party A to party B just by the statement. The statement has to be written in the shtar and the shtar handed over. Then you have this whole discussion as to whether these languages work to transfer the property. Tana Rabbanan, if a person, the Brisa says, Ha'omer asisi ploni avdi ben chorin. A person makes a statement and says, I made my slave a free man. V'hu omer, and the slave counters and says, Lo asa'ani, that never happened. Chayshinan, so who do we believe? The master or the slave? Chayshinan shema zika lo al yedei acher. It's not a matter of belief or not belief. We say the slave is saying, you didn't free me. We have to be concerned that when the master says, I freed you, perhaps he did write him a document of freedom, and he gave the document to another person on behalf of the slave. And therefore the slave does indeed go free. One more time. We're concerned maybe he gave it to another person. Sorry, that's it. What if the master, though, says, I wrote my slave a document of freedom, Vinasati lo, and I gave it to him. So now he's being very clear. He's not just saying, did I free you or did I not free you? He's saying, I wrote the document and I handed it to you. V'hu omer, and the slave says, Lo kasavli, v'lo nasanli. You never wrote it and you never gave it to me. So now there's a direct contradiction. Did the slave receive the document or did he not receive the document? So the Gemara concludes, Hoda'as baldin kemeya edim dami. If a person themselves admits to being in debt of something, that's like 100 edim. So if the slave himself is declaring himself still in the state of being a slave, he's saying, I am not free, so he's not free. Ha'omer nasati sa deplonis saploni. Similar idea with a field. If a person says, I gave this field to another person, v'hu omer, and the recipient says, lo nasanli, you never gave it to me. Chayshinan shema zika lo al yedei acher. We are concerned that perhaps, again, he gave the field to the recipient through a third party. Chasavti v'nasati lo. If he says, I wrote you a document and I gave you the field, v'hu omer, and the recipient says, lo kasav lo nasanli. You never did. It never happened. Hodas baldin kamei edim dami. In that case, again, if the recipient is denying the fact that he ever received it, it does not belong to him. So the Gemara asks, Mi ochel peiros. Ruvain says to Shimon, in our case, Ruvain says to Shimon, I wrote a document and I gave you this field. Shimon says, you never wrote the document, you never gave it to me, I don't own the field. So the question is, so we say, in that case, Hadas baldin k'me'edim dami, that the recipient indeed does not own the field. So the question is, okay, so what happens to all the produce of the field? Does that mean then that the original owner, Ruvain, gets to reap all the rewards of that? Rav Chisda Amar, no sein ochel peiros. Indeed, Ruvain, if we are saying that Shimon is believed and that Shimon does not have property of the field, he does not own the field, so then by default that means Ruvain owns it, and then Ruvain gets the peiros. V'Rabba Amar, and Rabba says, mishalshin es ha-peiros. We have to give the fruit to a third party, basically put them in holding until Eliyahu Hanavi comes, because we don't know what to do with them. The Gemara says, velo pligi, and there's no machlokas here. Ha be'aba, ha bibra. It depends who the two people are in court. If Ruvain says to Shimon, I gave you the field, I wrote a document and I presented it to you and I gave you the field, and Shimon says, no, you never did. So in that case, we say that Shimon is believed and it really never happened, and Ruvain has full ownership of the field. In the second case, when Rabba says that, and therefore Rav Chisda says that the owner gets to eat the fruit. Rabba says the owner does not get to eat the fruit. What's Rabba talking about? Rabba says, if Ruvain says to Shimon's son, I gave your father a field, I had a document and I gave it to him, and he says, no, you never did. So in that case, being the fact that the Shimon who's talking is not the actual party who was involved, but he's the child of the party involved, so Rabba says we have to be concerned in that case. Maybe the father really did give the field either to Shimon's father or to Ruvain perhaps gave the field to Shimon's father, or maybe gave it to a third party on behalf of Shimon's father, and therefore he's talking to Shimon right now, so therefore we say Ruvain himself cannot eat the fruits. The fruits have to be put in escrow, sort of, or held out, because perhaps really something did go on there. Okay, next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Eved sha'aso rabu apitiki lachirim. If you have a slave and the master made the slave a security for other people, so essentially the master borrowed money from a person, and he said, if I don't pay you back the loan, you can collect the amount of the loan, you can use my slave. Vishichriro, and he freed the slave. Now, who freed the slave? The Gemara is going to get into this. Either the original master freed the slave, the borrower freed the slave, or the lender freed the slave. We're going to see in a moment. So the Mishnah says, Shuras hadin ein ha'eved chayiv klum. The real baseline halacha is that the slave is not obligated to do anything. Ela mipnei tikun ha'olam. Because of tikun ha'olam, kofin esrabo v'osa oso ben chorin. We force the master to free the slave. Why are we forcing the master to free the slave if the Mishnah says he was already freed? The Gemara is going to explain all of this. The Mishnah doesn't really make sense if you just read it by itself. The Gemara is going to go through line by line what the Mishnah means. So I'm just going to read it through and then we'll begin the Gemara. Rabbi v'kosif shtar al damav, and we make the slave write a document for his value. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Eino kosev, we do not make him write a document for his value. Ela meshachrer, rather we just free him. Okay, what is going on here? So the Gemara will explain. Eved sha'asa rabba apatiki v'shichero. You have a slave. The master made the slave basically a lien for a certain loan. V'shichero, and then he was slaved. Mi shichero, who freed the slave? Amar Rav says, Rabo Rishon. So what you have here is like this. A guy borrowed money. Ruvain borrowed $100. And he says to Shimon, if I don't pay you back the $100, you can have my slave. And then Ruvain went ahead and he freed the slave. So Shuras Hadin, Ein Ha'eved Chayev Klum. By the letter of the law, the slave does not have to do anything. L'rabo Sheni, for the second guy, meaning for the lender, for Shimon. Ruvain borrowed $100. He said, if I don't pay you back, you have my slave. Then Ruvain went ahead and he freed the slave. So then Shimon says, okay, not going to have a slave. You didn't pay me back. So it says by the letter of the law, Slave doesn't owe a dime to Shimon, nothing. Shimon lost the rights to the slave. Why? Kidder Rava. Because Rava says to Amar Rava, hektish, if a person has a cow, let's say, any kind of animal, which they made a apotiki, meaning they made it as a security on a loan, and then they were makdish it, they gave it to the Beis HaMikdash. Chametz, or they had food, which was this security on the loan, and then Pesach occurred, and the food became aser b'hana. V'shichrur, or if they have a slave and they freed the slave, mafkiin midei shibud, that undoes the security. Ela mipnei tikun ha'olam. So if that undoes the security, going back to our case, Reuven borrows $100 from Shimon. He says, if I don't pay you back, you get to use the slave. Then Reuven goes ahead and he frees the slave. So now that's it. Shimon can't use the Shimon can't do anything. He can't go and now use the slave because Reuven freed him. However, mipnei tikun ha'olam, because of tikun ha'olam, shema yimtze'enu b'shuk. What might happen? On to Mem Aleph Amud Aleph at the top. Shimon will see the slave at the store the next day, v'yomer lo, and he's going to say to him, Avdi ata, you belong to me, because Reuven owes me $100. He didn't pay me $100, and you were earmarked as the lien, so you belong to me. And we don't want these kind of statements, these rumors starting to surface. It's not really true. He doesn't belong to him because the slave was freed. So Shimon lost out. That's unfortunate. But the slave doesn't belong to Shimon. So what do? In order to prevent these rumors, Kofinis Rabo Sheni, we tell Shimon, V'osa oso ben chorin, we tell Shimon, you must write a document freeing the slave, even though he technically doesn't own the slave, but just to preclude any potential of him going ahead and starting to say that he does own him, we say, okay, you know what, so we're going to play your game. You must write the document that frees the slave. V'kosev eved shtar al damav, and the slave then, and then we write a document for the slave for how much the slave is worth. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Ein ha'eved kosev ela mishacher. We don't have to do that. The slave doesn't have to pay the money. Rather, the first master, the person who freed him, has to pay the money. B'mai kamiflagi, what's the machlokas? B'mazik shibudo shochavero kamiflagi. There is a basic machlokas here, and with this we'll conclude. What happens if somebody ruins something that is supposed to be a lien for someone else? So in this case, the slave was designated as a lien on the loan, and Reuven came along and he freed the slave, which undid the lien. So what are the responsibilities that Reuven has towards Shimon because he ruined that? Demar Savar, one opinion says, Chayav, that if you ruin the lien of someone else, you're chayav to reimburse them for that. Umar Savar, Pater, and one says you are exempt. It's Marnami. It is also said, Hamazik Shibudo Shochavero, somebody who damages the lien of their friend, Banu Lemachlokas, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel v'Rabbanan. This is the machlokas of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the Rabbanan in our Mishnah, where the master frees the slave who is set aside as a lien, and therefore the question is, who owes the money to the second person, to the lender, to Shimon? Who owes the money? Does the master have to pay, or do we make the slave pay? The slave doesn't really owe the money, but the slave does receive the benefit of having been freed, and therefore perhaps we make him pay. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Okay. You just have to connect with you.